Adam sat in the dimly lit study of his family's estate, the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders. The Hawthorne fortune, once vast and unshakable, was now teetering on the edge of collapse. His father's poor investments had left the family vulnerable, and there was only one way to save it: a marriage to Emma Devereaux, the daughter of a powerful financier. It wasn't a love match, but a calculated arrangement meant to prevent the fortune from being seized by their competitors. Adam had only met Emma twice. She was beautiful, yes, with raven black hair and striking blue eyes, but she was as much a stranger to him as the moon. They exchanged polite conversation at their brief encounters, but nothing deeper. Now he had no choice but to marry her, bind his life to hers, to secure the future of the family he was born into. The day of the wedding came quickly. The ceremony was grand but impersonal, held in a cathedral whose grandeur only heightened the surrealness of it all. As he stood at the altar, watching Emma approach in a white gown that shimmered like moonlight, Adam felt a pang of guilt. He was marrying her not for love, but for obligation. Did she feel the same? Emma's face betrayed nothing. She walked down the aisle with poise, her expression calm, though her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite read. Was it sadness? Resignation? They exchanged vows mechanically, the words feeling hollow in the vastness of the cathedral. "I do," Emma said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Adam hesitated for a brief second, his mind spinning with the gravity of the moment. He glanced at her and saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes too. Was this what their lives had become? A transaction? "I do," he finally said, sealing their fates. That evening, in the quiet of their new shared home, they sat together, the weight of the day pressing down on them. Emma sat across from him, staring out the window, the moon casting a soft glow on her face. For a moment, Adam wondered what kind of life she had imagined before this, before they were both thrust into a marriage of necessity. "You don't have to pretend," Emma said suddenly, breaking the silence. Adam looked at her, surprised. "Pretend what?" "That this is something either of us wanted," she said, her voice steady but tinged with a sadness he hadn't expected. "We're strangers bound by a contract, not love." He didn't know how to respond. The truth of her words stung, but it also felt like a relief. "I never wanted this for either of us," Adam admitted. "But I had no choice. My family needs saving," she finished for him. "And mine does too, in its own way." For the first time, they shared something real, an acknowledgement of the heavy burden they both carried. It wasn't love, but perhaps it was a start. Adam leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What do we do now?" Emma turned to face him, her expression softening. "We do what we must. We make this work." Adam rose from his chair, his footsteps echoing softly in the quiet of the room. "There's something I want to show you," he said, his voice calm, yet filled with an undercurrent of uncertainty. Emma followed him without a word, her elegant gown whispering across the polished wooden floors as they walked through the long hallway of the estate. They stopped in front of a large oak door. Adam hesitated for a brief moment before opening it, revealing a spacious room bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. The room had been meticulously prepared: plush bedding, elegant furnishings, and a vase of fresh roses sitting on the nightstand. It was clear he had taken care to make it comfortable, inviting even. A place where she could feel at ease. "This is for you," he said quietly, stepping aside to let her take it all in. "I wanted you to have a choice. You can stay here, if that's what you prefer." Emma stepped inside, her eyes sweeping over the room. It was beautiful, and part of her was grateful for the gesture. But there was an undeniable tension in the air, a quiet question left unspoken between them. She turned back toward Adam, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable but his eyes soft, watching her carefully. "And the other option?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Adam shifted slightly, the weight of his offer hanging in the air. "The other option is my room," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't expect anything from you. This arrangement is as much about your comfort as it is mine. But I want to give you the choice." Emma held his gaze for a long moment. She could see the honesty in his eyes, the unspoken promise that he wouldn't force her into anything she didn't want. He had been respectful, considerate even, but there was still an undeniable awkwardness between them. They were husband and wife in name, but in truth, they were strangers still trying to find their way through this unexpected life together. She glanced back at the prepared room. It was welcoming, a space that would offer her privacy, time to adjust. Yet a small part of her, a part she barely acknowledged, felt a flicker of reluctance. Would choosing this room put even more distance between them? Would it make it harder to bridge the gap between their lives? I think, Emma began, her voice soft as she turned back toward Adam. For now, I'll stay here. Adam nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile crossing his lips. I understand. He stepped into the room briefly, placing the key on a small table near the door. If you need anything, I'm just down the hall. My room is always open to you. Emma watched him as he left, the door closing gently behind him. She stood there for a moment, her heart feeling heavy with the complexity of the situation. It was the logical choice, the safer one, but still, something within her stirred, a whisper of uncertainty, of possibilities not yet explored. With a sigh, she walked over to the bed and sat down, running her fingers lightly over the smooth fabric of the coverlet. She had made her decision, but as she looked around the room, a quiet realization crept in. While it was her choice to stay here, it didn't feel entirely right. She didn't know what the future held for her and Adam, but something told her that the walls between them, both literal and metaphorical, couldn't remain forever. In the weeks that followed, Adam and Emma spent much of their time working together, trying to save the Hawthorne estate from financial ruin. The days were long, filled with meetings with stakeholders, reviewing accounts, and strategizing with the family's business associates. They were both focused, each bringing their own strengths to the table. Adam's knowledge of the family's history and Emma's sharp eye for numbers and negotiation. It began with small gestures, almost imperceptible at first. They exchanged fleeting smiles, once strained and formal, now beginning to carry a hint of warmth. The conversations, once businesslike, started to veer toward personal matters, a shared memory from their separate pasts, a moment of humor when something went wrong in the day. There were times when they worked late into the evening, the glow of the fireplace casting a soft light on Emma's face as she studied the ledgers. Adam found himself watching her more often, her lips slightly parted as she concentrated, the way her fingers moved deftly across the papers, and the grace with which she carried herself even in stressful moments. She was no longer just the woman he had married out of necessity. She was becoming someone he admired deeply, someone he was beginning to want. One afternoon, they were hosting a meeting with a group of stakeholders in one of their estate's drawing room. The room was filled with men in dark suits, discussing the estate's future in heavy tones, but Emma held her own. She spoke clearly and confidently, laying out a detailed plan that left the room silent with admiration. Adam, standing at her side, watched as she navigated the conversation with ease, her calm yet commanding presence drawing the respect of everyone present. At one point, one of the older stakeholders, a longtime family associate, leaned over to Adam and whispered, "Your wife, she's something else, isn't she?" Adam's chest swelled with pride, but it wasn't just because of her success in the moment. It was because he realized he had been watching her this way for weeks, slowly falling for the woman who had become his partner in every sense of the word. He saw the subtle way she handled difficult negotiations, the way her eyes lit up when she came up with a solution, and the care she took to protect both his family's legacy and the people involved. When the meeting ended and the stakeholders left, Emma and Adam stood in the hallway, watching as the last of their guests filed out. Emma exhaled, relieved to have made it through the day. "That went well," she said, glancing up at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "It did," Adam replied, his voice low. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her. Her hair was slightly tousled from the long day, her cheeks flushed from the effort, and her lips curved in a way that sent a warmth through him he hadn't expected. "You are incredible." Emma blushed, brushing off the compliment as she always did. "I was just doing what needed to be done." But Adam couldn't let it go. As they walked together back to the study, side by side, he felt an overwhelming desire to reach for her hand, to close the distance between them. He had never felt so drawn to someone before, especially not in the way he now found himself drawn to Emma. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was beautiful beyond words. It was her intelligence, her strength, the way she carried the weight of their shared responsibilities with grace. That evening, as they finished their work and prepared to leave the estate for the day, Adam found himself lagging behind, watching as Emma thanked the staff and offered a few kind words to the housekeeper. She had grown into her role here, not just as his wife, but as a leader, and everyone around them had begun to notice. As they stepped out into the cool evening air, the sun sinking low on the horizon, Adam couldn't help but glance at her again, the golden light catching in her hair and making her look like something out of a dream. He found himself imagining what it would be like when they returned home, when it would just be the two of them, without the weight of meetings or expectations. He thought about sitting with her by the fire, about her laughter echoing in the quiet house, about being close to her in a way he hadn't yet allowed himself to be. The thought of it filled him with a longing that caught him off guard. He wanted to be alone with her, not out of duty or obligation, but because, for the first time, he craved her company. He wanted to see her smile just for him, to hear her speak about anything but business. He wanted to feel the warmth of her beside him, to reach for her and have her be close, truly close, in a way they hadn't been before. "Let's go home," Adam said softly, his voice low and filled with unspoken desire. Emma turned to look at him, her expression softening as if she sensed the shift in him. She smiled, a little shyly, and nodded. "Let's." As they made their way to the car, Adam couldn't shake the anticipation building within him. He knew that tonight, something would change between them. He could feel it in the way her hand brushed against his as they climbed into the car, in the quiet moments when their eyes met and held. He wasn't just eager to be home, he was eager to be with her, to truly be with her for the first time. That night, after they arrived home, the tension between them had shifted into something unspoken but undeniable. Adam could feel it humming in the air between them, even as they went through the motions of settling in. Emma excused herself to shower, her voice casual, though her eyes lingered on him for a fraction longer than usual. Adam, left alone, made his way to the kitchen, his mind spinning with thoughts of her. He poured himself a drink, the cool glass of whiskey trembling slightly in his hand as he brought it to his lips. He took a slow sip, hoping the alcohol would calm the yearn building inside him, but it didn't help. His thoughts were consumed by Emma. The way she had smiled at him earlier, the way her presence filled the room even when she wasn't there. As he stood at the countertop, lost in his thoughts, he noticed Emma's purse sitting nearby. Just as he considered whether to leave it or take it to her, her phone began to buzz inside the bag. Instinctively, Adam reached for it, pulling the purse from the counter. It wasn't the kind of ringing he could ignore, and something about the thought of just walking into her space felt oddly intimate. He walked down the hall toward her bedroom, feeling the soft thud of his heartbeat against his ribs. When he reached the door, he noticed it was slightly ajar. He hesitated, unsure whether to knock or leave the purse and step away. But before he could decide, the door opened fully, and Emma stepped out of the bathroom. She was completely naked, her skin glistening from the shower, her damp hair cascading over her shoulders. Time seemed to freeze for Adam. For a brief moment, he forgot everything, his reason for being there, the phone in his hand, the world outside the door. All he could see was her, every inch of her laid bare before him, stunning and vulnerable in her natural beauty. He blinked, his breath catching in his throat as the weight of the moment hit him. I'm sorry, he stammered, immediately turning his gaze to the floor. Your phone was ringing. I thought I'd bring it to you. Emma's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't flinch or cover herself. There was a brief, awkward pause before she spoke, her voice calm. Thank you, Adam, she said softly. He couldn't bring himself to look at her again, not like this. He stepped back quickly, retreating from the doorway as she moved to close it behind him. As he made his way back down the hallway, his heart raced, and a part of him couldn't help but think of how lucky he was. His wife, The woman he had come to respect and admire in so many ways had a beauty that went beyond anything he had imagined. It wasn't just her appearance, though. It was the way she carried herself, the grace in her movements, the strength she exuded even in her vulnerability. Back in the kitchen, Adam set the purse down and leaned against the counter, running a hand through his hair. He took another long sip of whiskey, hoping it would cool the heat coursing through him. The image of her naked form lingered in his mind, and for a moment, he let himself revel in the idea of what it meant to be married to her. But then, reality came crashing back. This was still, in many ways, a marriage of business. She had chosen to sleep in a separate room. Their relationship, despite its growing intimacy, was still bound by the terms they had agreed upon. He exhaled deeply, trying to regain control over his thoughts. She's your wife in business, he reminded himself, not in love. He couldn't afford to let his feelings complicate things. They had built something together, a partnership based on mutual respect, and letting himself fall too deeply into desire could ruin that. Just as he was beginning to calm his racing thoughts, Adam heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around, and there was Emma, walking into the kitchen, her damp hair still falling in waves over her shoulders. She was wearing a silk bathrobe, loosely tied at the waist, the fabric clinging to her skin. The robe was half open, revealing the soft curve of her collarbone, the edge of her breasts, and a glimpse of her toned legs beneath the shimmering fabric. Adam's throat went dry. She moved with an effortless grace, her eyes meeting his as she approached the counter. Her gaze was softer now, less guarded than it had been earlier. He could see it, the shift in the way she looked at him, the same awareness of something more between them. "Thank you for bringing my phone," she said quietly, her voice smooth like the silk she wore. She didn't seem embarrassed about what had happened, but there was a subtle tension between them that hadn't been there before. "I didn't mean to surprise you." Adam swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure as his eyes traveled from her face to the barely concealed curves beneath her robe. "It's fine. I should have knocked." Emma smiled softly, leaning against the counter beside him. "It's okay, Adam," she said, her voice dipping slightly, an invitation in her tone. She was close enough now that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. He caught a faint scent of jasmine, mingling with the clean scent of her shower, and it made his pulse quicken. They stood there for a long moment, the quiet between them thick with unspoken thoughts. He could feel the weight of her presence, the closeness of her body. His eyes flicked to her robe, which had fallen open just a bit more, revealing more of her skin, more of the woman he had tried so hard not to think of in this way. But it was impossible now. She was standing right there, watching him with those deep blue eyes, waiting for something. For the first time, Adam wasn't sure if they were still bound by the same unspoken rules that had governed their marriage up until now. He wanted her, desperately, and by the way she lingered, he sensed that she wanted something, too. Adam stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, watching as Emma moved closer, her robe parting slightly with each step. Her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were softer now, filled with something that made his pulse race. There was no business between them at this moment, no contracts, no expectations. Only a raw, unspoken desire. Emma's gaze held his, her movements slow and deliberate as she crept into his arms, her hands sliding up his chest until they rested on his shoulders. Adam's breath hitched at the warmth of her touch, the softness of her body pressing against his. Without a word, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her flush against him, his heart thundering in his chest. Their eyes locked, the air between them thick with anticipation, and then, finally, Adam couldn't hold back any longer. He leaned down, capturing her lips with his in a kiss that was deep, urgent, and filled with every ounce of longing he had been holding back for weeks. Emma melted into him, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt as she kissed him back just as passionately, her body molding to his as if she had been waiting for this moment just as much as he had. He pulled her even closer, one hand tangling in her damp hair, the other sliding down the curve of her back to hold her tight. She gasped softly into his mouth, her body trembling slightly in his arms, and Adam pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his breath coming fast and uneven. "Do you want me to stop?" he asked, his voice rough with desire, but laced with respect, his eyes searching hers for the answer. Emma shook her head slowly, her lips still parted, her breath warm against his skin. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but filled with certainty. "Don't stop." That was all he needed to hear. Adam's lips crashed against hers again, more fiercely this time, as his hands roamed her body, caressing every inch of her he could reach. His fingers trailed down the exposed skin of her chest, brushing against the edge of her robe before he slipped it off her shoulders. The silk fell to the floor in a soft whisper, leaving her bare beneath his touch. He groaned at the sensation of her skin against his, feeling the heat between them rise to a fever pitch. Emma arched into him, her soft moans driving him wild as he traced the curve of her spine, pulling her even closer. She pressed her lips to his neck, her breath hot against his ear. And then, in a voice filled with need, she whispered, "Take me to your bedroom." Adam's heart pounded in his chest as he lifted her into his arms, his hands gripping her thighs as she wrapped her legs around his waist. He carried her down the hallway, their lips never parting, and pushed open the door to his bedroom with his shoulder. The room was dimly lit, the bed looming in the center, but all Adam could focus on was the woman in his arms. He laid her down gently on the bed, her body bathed in the soft glow of moonlight streaming in through the window. She looked up at him, her chest rising and falling with quickened breaths, her eyes filled with anticipation and something deeper, a vulnerability she had never shown him before. Adam knelt beside the bed, his hands resting on her thighs as he slowly spread her legs, his gaze never leaving hers. Emma's breath hitched as his hands moved upward, caressing her skin with reverence, his fingers brushing the delicate places that made her body shiver beneath his touch. He bent down, pressing soft kisses to the inside of her thighs, his lips trailing higher and higher until she was trembling with anticipation. And then, without a word, he dipped his head between her legs, his tongue tracing delicate circles that made her gasp and moan, her hands gripping the sheets as waves of pleasure washed over her. Emma's back arched off the bed, her breath coming in quick, ragged gasps as he worked her with an intensity that left her completely undone. Her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, urging him on as her moans grew louder, her body teetering on the edge of something explosive. And then, with a final gasp, she cried out his name, her entire body shaking as she came apart beneath him. Adam held her thighs firmly, riding out her waves of pleasure, his heart swelling with satisfaction at the way she responded to him. When her breathing began to slow, he crawled up her body, kissing her lips softly as he positioned himself above her. Emma looked up at him, her eyes glazed with desire, and without hesitation, she wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him closer. Adam leaned down, kissing her deeply as he entered her slowly. He moved within her, each thrust slow and deliberate. He savored the moment like it was something sacred. For the first time, he was making love to Emma, not as a partner in a contract, but as his wife, the woman he had longed for, craved. Every gasp, every soft moan from her lips made his heart swell with a deep satisfaction. He felt the weight of their connection, the intimacy of their bodies entwined, and it was more than physical, it was a release of everything he had held back. In this moment, he felt complete, fulfilled in a way he had never imagined, finally making love to the woman who had become his everything. Emma gasped softly against his lips, her hands gripping his shoulders as she met his strokes, slow and measured at first, building in intensity as their need for each other grew. They moved together in perfect rhythm, their bodies perfectly in sync, as if they had been made for each other. Every moan, every gasp, every whispered name was a testament to the undeniable chemistry that had been simmering between them for so long. It was more than passion. It was a release, an unspoken connection that had been waiting to be set free. Adam's movements became more urgent, his hands gripping her hips as he drove deeper, harder, both of them lost in the intensity of the moment. Emma's nails dug into his back as she clung to him, her moans filling the room, her body trembling with pleasure as he brought her to the brink again and again. And then, with a final thrust, they both cried out in unison, their bodies shuddering together as they reached the peak of their shared desire. Adam collapsed beside her, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. They lay there for a long while, their bodies entwined, the quiet of the room filled only with the sound of their breathing. Adam turned to look at her, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she smiled softly up at him. This wasn't just a marriage of business anymore. Something deeper had been forged between them tonight, something neither of them could deny.